The mountains didn't care how well you thought you'd built your cabin. In the early 1800s, winters in the Rocky Mountains weren't measured by inconvenience. They were measured by what failed. Roofs failed, chimneys failed, firewood plans failed, and sometimes people failed with them. Men arrived with confidence. They cut thick logs, they stacked them tight. They built heavy stone hearths and told themselves that hard work would be enough. By frontier standards, many of those cabins were good. Straight walls, solid corners, a roof that could shed snow. On paper, they should have worked. Then November came. The wind didn't knock. It found every seam. It slipped between logs under sills around door frames. Even when the fire burned all day, the cold stayed.
Most cabins
not a
do
sharp
not fail
cold,
by
a
collapsing,
draining one.
but by bleeding
The kind
heat
that
day
seeps
after
into bone, slows hands, shortens tempers, and forces decisions no one wants to make. Men learned fast that winter wasn't beaten by effort alone. You could cut more wood. You could feed the fire every 2 hours. You could sleep in your coat and tell yourself that's just how frontier life was. But none of that changed the math. Heat left those cabins almost as fast as it was made. Families huddled near stoves. Corners of rooms stayed unusable.
Movement, not
Water
temperature,
froze
is the real
inside.
enemy.
Frost crept along interior walls. The cabin stood, but living inside it became a daily negotiation with the cold. This was the quiet truth of frontier winters. Most cabins didn't fail structurally. They failed thermally. They didn't collapse. They just couldn't hold warmth. And when a cabin can't hold heat, everything else costs more. More wood, more labor, more exhaustion, more risk. Some men accepted that as the price of living in the mountains. Others started asking a different question. Not how to make more heat, but why the heat was leaving so fast in the first place. That question would separate the cabins that merely survived winter from the ones that made it livable. He wasn't trying to outwork winter. That's what set him apart. Most mountain men believed the solution was simple cut. More wood burn, bigger fires endure. This man had done all of that already. He knew the routine. He knew the sound of a stove that never rested, and the cost that came with it. Split knuckles, aching backs and nights, broken by alarms to feed the fire. He also knew something else. No matter how hard you worked, the cold always seemed to win. He wasn't educated in any formal way. No books on engineering, no training in architecture. What he had was time years spent watching wind move through trees, snow pile against ridge lines, and heat vanish the moment a door opened. He lived alone for long stretches. That kind of solitude teaches you fast, or it finishes you. What he noticed wasn't the cold itself. It was how aggressive the wind was, how it pressed against walls, slid under floors, and pulled warmth away without ever touching the fire. He noticed that calm days felt warmer, even when the temperature was the same.
This wall won't keep trouble out, it'll just pen us in.
So instead of fighting the cold head-on, he stopped engaging it the way everyone else did. He didn't chase more fuel. He didn't thicken his walls. He didn't brag about endurance. He paid attention to where heat was being lost and asked one blunt question. What if the wind never touched the cabin at all? That idea sounded wrong to other men. Cabins were cabins, walls were walls. You built them solid and accepted the rest. Anything beyond that felt unnecessary, even suspicious. Some thought he was overthinking things. Others thought he was avoiding hard work. But he wasn't avoiding effort. He was redirecting it. He understood a quiet frontier truth that many missed winter doesn't defeat you all at once. It wears you down through small losses that never stop. If you stop those losses even partly, you change the whole equation. He wasn't trying to be clever. He was trying to stay warm without losing everything else in the process. Frontier cabins didn't lose heat because they were poorly built. They lost heat because they were built to stand, not to protect. A typical mountain cabin relied on mass, thick logs, heavy corners. The belief was simple: more wood meant more warmth, and to a point that was true. Logs slow heat loss better than thin boards. Stone foundations kept floors from rotting. Everything looked solid, but winter exposed the weakness in that thinking. Heat doesn't disappear quietly, it moves, and in the mountains it moves fast. The first problem was air. Cabins breathed whether you wanted them to or not. Every seam between logs, every imperfect notch, every door and window frame leaked. When the wind blew, cold air didn't just slip inside, it pushed warm air out. That exchange never stopped. A fire could be roaring and the cabin would still feel hollow. The second problem was surface exposure. Wind doesn't just chill the air inside a cabin, it scrapes heat directly off the walls. Each gust pulls warmth from the logs themselves. The harder the wind, the faster the loss. In exposed valleys and ridgelines, that stripping effect was constant. The third problem was night. Clear winter skies drain heat upward. Logs radiate warmth into open space. Once the sun dropped, the cabin began losing energy in all directions at once. Fires fought that loss, but they rarely won for long. Most builders responded the same way. They burned more wood. They stayed closer to the stove. They accepted that some rooms would remain cold all winter. What they didn't do was question the assumption that the cabin wall had to face the wind directly. That was the mistake. A wall that stands strong against pressure is not the same as a wall that holds heat. Frontier builders had mastered strength. They had not mastered control. And until someone figured out how to stop wind from touching the cabin at all winter, would continue to take more than it gave. The idea didn't sound smart when he said it out loud. That was part of the problem. He wasn't talking about thicker logs or tighter joints. He wasn't talking about a bigger stove or a better chimney. He was talking about building another wall and not attaching it to the first one. Most men heard that and stopped listening. On the frontier, walls were meant to be solid. You stacked logs tight because gaps meant death. You pressed everything together because space was the enemy. Empty space meant drafts, weakness, failure. So when he suggested leaving a deliberate gap, an empty zone between two walls, it sounded backward. Some laughed. Others shook their heads. Why build a wall that doesn't hold anything? One man asked. What good is air? Another said. You'll just trap cold, someone else muttered. From the outside, it looked wasteful. Extra labor, extra material, no obvious gain. Frontier life punished waste, and this looked like waste by design. But the man wasn't thinking about walls as barriers. He was thinking about them as shields. He had noticed something most people ignored. On calm days, even bitterly cold ones, the cabin felt manageable. On windy days, even mild cold felt brutal. That told him the problem wasn't temperature alone. It was movement. So his stupid idea was simple: stop the wind before it ever touched the real cabin wall. Not with insulation packed tight, not with tar or mud or extra chinking, but with distance, space. A second surface placed far enough away that the air between couldn't move freely. He didn't have words for it. He didn't call it a buffer or an envelope. He just knew that still air behaved differently than moving air. To other men, it sounded like he was afraid of the cold. In truth, he was done wasting heat on it. The wall wasn't meant to be strong. It was meant to be in the way. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. Air doesn't feel like protection. That's why most people don't trust it. On the frontier, weight meant safety. Thickness meant warmth. If something was light, empty, or invisible, it was assumed to be useless against winter. But the man had learned otherwise, not from books, but from living in the cold long enough to notice patterns. Moving air is the enemy. Still air is something else entirely. When wind hits a cabin wall, it doesn't just make things feel colder. It strips heat away. Fast, relentless. Every gust pulls warmth off the surface and replaces it with cold. That process never stops as long as air is moving. But air that can't move behaves differently. Trapped air doesn't carry heat away. It holds it. Not perfectly, but steadily. That's why fur works. That's why feathers work. Not because they're thick, but because they trap pockets of air and keep them still. The man understood this instinctively. He'd slept in snow shelters that were warmer than open cabins. He'd noticed how caves stayed calm even in storms. He'd seen how animals survived by layering space, not mass. So the gap between the walls wasn't empty to him. It was active. That dead air space slowed heat loss in every direction. The outer wall took the wind. The inner wall stayed calm. Between them the air settled. No drafts, no pressure, no constant exchange pulling warmth out. Most cabins bled heat because they let the wind touch everything. This one didn't. The trick wasn't sealing the cabin tighter. It was giving heat a place to linger before it could escape. That pause made all the difference. People thought he was building extra cold into his home. What he was really doing was giving heat time, and in winter time is everything. The wall wasn't complicated. That was another reason people doubted it. There were no special materials, no rare tools, nothing that looked impressive. Everything came from what he already had or could gather without leaving the valley. He set the second wall far enough from the cabin to matter, not inches, feet, close enough to protect, far enough to keep the air between them from being pushed or pulled by the wind. That gap was the whole point. The outer wall didn't need to be strong. It needed to stand. He used rough-cut board saplings, even sections of split logs set vertically. In places where wood was scarce, he packed earth against the outside of the frame, not tight, never tight. The goal was to slow air, not stop it completely. He avoided one mistake many would have made, filling the space. Straw, moss, soil, scrap cloth. All of it stayed out of the gap. Packed insulation would have turned the space into a cold sponge. He wanted air that stayed dry and still. At the bottom and near the top, he left small openings, not drafts, just breathing points, enough to let moisture escape slowly so frost wouldn't build up. The air inside the gap moved, but only on its own time. The door was handled the same way. An outer door, then a short step inside, then the real cabin door. Wind died in that space before it reached the living area. Nothing about the construction looked refined. The lines were rough, the surfaces uneven. From a distance it looked like a half-finished mistake. But it did exactly what it was supposed to do. The outer wall took the wind. The inner wall stayed calm. The space between them stayed quiet. That silence was the sound of heat staying where it belonged. Winter wouldn't notice it at first. But when it did, the difference would be impossible to ignore. The real test didn't come with construction. It came with silence. The first storms arrived early. Wind rolled down the slopes and pressed hard against anything standing in its path. Snow didn't drift gently. It packed itself into corners and buried tracks overnight. This was the kind of winter that exposed mistakes fast. Neighbors prepared the way they always had. Woodpiles grew, fires stayed lit around the clock. Men planned their days around the stove, cut, split, burn, repeat. Nights were broken into short sleeps between tending the fire. That was normal. In the double-walled cabin, things felt different almost immediately. The fire burned the same as before, no bigger, no hotter, but the room didn't cool the moment the flames settled. Corners stayed usable. The floor didn't bite at bare feet. The air felt steady instead of restless. On windy nights when other cabins groaned and whistled, this one stayed quiet. That quiet mattered. It meant the heat wasn't being pulled away every second. It meant the walls weren't fighting pressure. It meant the fire was finally doing more than just replacing losses. As the cold deepened, the contrast sharpened. Outside, temperatures dropped well below anything comfortable. Inside, life continued without adjustment. Meals were eaten at the table, not next to the stove. Work got done without gloves. Sleep came without waking to add wood every few hours. The man didn't celebrate. He watched. He checked the walls for moisture. Dry. He checked the gap for frost. None. The air moved slowly, just enough to stay clean. The system wasn't straining. It was settling in. That was the signal he trusted most. Most failures announced themselves loudly. Ice rot, collapse, smoke. This one stayed quiet because it was doing exactly what it was meant to do. The winter kept pushing. Wind howled harder. Cold pressed deeper. The cabin didn't fight back. It simply refused to give up what it already had, and that refusal would soon become visible to anyone paying attention. People noticed before anyone said anything. It started with the smoke. Other cabins pushed thick plumes into the sky from dawn to night. That meant constant feeding of the fire, constant loss. From this cabin, the smoke stayed thin and steady, not struggling, not desperate. Then there was the woodpile. While others burned through stacks meant to last until spring, his pile shrank slowly, too slowly. Men who passed by counted logs without meaning to. They did the math in their heads and didn't like the answer. Someone finally stepped inside. The difference was immediate. Not heat like a blast from a stove, but warmth that filled the room evenly. No sharp cold near the walls. No dead corners. Just a steady temperature that didn't care where you stood. One man checked the fire first. It wasn't roaring. That ruled out the obvious explanation. Another touched the wall. Cool, but not cold. That ruled out luck. Then someone asked the question that mattered. How warm is it in here? The answer didn't sound dramatic. It didn't need to. It was simply higher than it should have been by a wide margin during weather that punished everything else. That number traveled faster than the explanation ever could. Men argued about it at first. Faulty judgment, temporary conditions, a better stove, anything except the wall. But the cold didn't ease, and the number didn't drop. In nearby cabins, families slept in layers. Fires ran non-stop. Rooms stayed marginal. In this one, people moved freely. They worked. They rested. They lived. Mockery depends on uncertainty. Once the result becomes repeatable, laughter fades. The wall didn't win an argument. It ended one. From that point on, no one asked whether the idea worked. They asked how much warmer it was and how long it stayed that way. And that changed the conversation completely. What he built didn't succeed because it was clever. It succeeded because it stopped the wrong fight. Most cabins treated winter like an enemy that had to be overpowered. Bigger fires, thicker walls, more effort. That approach assumed heat loss was inevitable and focused only on replacing it faster. This wall did something different. It refused to let the loss happen in the first place. The key wasn't insulation in the modern sense. It was control. Wind control, air control, time control. By stopping wind at the outer wall, the cabin's real structure was never exposed to pressure. No scouring, no suction pulling warmth out of the logs. The inner wall lived in calm air, and calm air behaves predictably. Heat that enters a calm space doesn't rush to leave. It spreads slowly, it settles. It sinks into wood, earth, and stone. Those materials then release it back at their own pace. That's what turned the cabin into a thermal battery. Other cabins lost heat the moment the fire slowed. This one stored it. The dead air gap did more than insulate. It broke the feedback loop that drained energy non-stop. Without moving air, there was no constant exchange. The fire wasn't chasing losses anymore. It was building a reserve. That's why the system kept working at night. That's why temperatures didn't crash when the stove burned down. That's why mornings felt like evenings instead of emergencies. People assumed success meant more heat. In reality, it meant less waste. The trick didn't rely on perfect materials or careful craftsmanship. It relied on respecting how heat actually behaves in cold, windy places. It worked because it aligned with physics instead of arguing with it. Most frontier solutions failed because they asked too much of people. This one asked less and got more. That's why it held when others didn't. The idea didn't spread because anyone promoted it. It spread because people were cold. On the frontier, men didn't adopt new methods because they sounded good. They adopted them because something nearby worked better than what they were doing. Once that happened, pride became optional. At first, visitors came for other reasons: borrowing tools, trading supplies, checking traps. They stayed longer than planned. They took their coats off without thinking about it. They noticed they weren't standing close to the fire. They didn't ask many questions, not at first. Frontier men watched before they spoke. They counted how often wood was added. They noticed how the room felt hours after the fire had been fed. They paid attention to mornings. Mornings told the truth. When they left, they didn't announce conclusions. They went home and thought about it. A week later, someone built a rough outer wall on the windward side of his cabin. Not the whole structure, just the side that took the worst weather. He didn't mention where the idea came from. He just said he was trying something. Another man stretched canvas over a simple frame and left space between it and his logs. Someone else stacked split wood along one wall, not tight just enough to block wind and create a buffer. None of it looked official. All of it made a difference. By the time spring came, no one called it stupid anymore. There was no announcement, no argument settled in public, just fewer complaints about cold, fewer midnight trips to the woodpile, less smoke hanging over the valley. That's how real frontier knowledge moved. Not through explanations, through results. Men didn't need to understand every reason it worked. They only needed to see that it did. Once winter stopped dominating every decision, the idea had already won. Quietly, without credit or ceremony, the wall trick became part of how people thought about shelter. And once that shift happened, there was no going back. No two cabins used the idea the same way. That was another reason it lasted. On the frontier, copying something exactly was rare. Materials were different. Land was different. Wind came from different directions. So people adapted the principle instead of the structure. Some built a full second wall just like the original. Others only protected the side that took the hardest wind. In narrow valleys, that was often the north or west face. On open ridges, it was whatever direction the storms favored. One man built a lean-to style shell that wrapped halfway around his cabin. Another stacked split cordwood along an outer frame, leaving a hand's width of space between the pile and the logs. That wall served two purposes. It blocked wind and stored fuel where snow couldn't bury it. In places with less timber, men used earth. They packed soil against a rough outer wall, but kept it loose enough that air could still sit inside the gap. It wasn't pretty, It didn't last forever, but it worked through winter. Canvas showed up in a few places. Stretched tight over poles set away from the cabin wall, it stopped wind cold. Men learned quickly that canvas didn't need to be thick. It just needed to interrupt movement. The spacing changed too. Some gaps were wide enough to walk through, others were narrow just enough to break airflow. What mattered wasn't size, it was stillness. Ventilation stayed consistent across all versions. Small openings low and high, never sealed tight. Moisture had to escape slowly or the whole thing failed. That lesson spread fast because the men who ignored it paid for it with rot and frost. What united all these variations was restraint. Nobody tried to make the wall airtight. Nobody filled the gap solid. Nobody turned it into another room. The moment air could move freely, the benefit dropped. They weren't building insulation. They were building calm. Once people understood that the design became flexible, it could be built with whatever was on hand. It could be repaired easily. It didn't depend on precision. It depended on respecting one simple rule. Stop the wind first. Everything else follows. The warmth was obvious, but it wasn't the most important change. What mattered more was what stopped happening. People slept through the night. Not in short stretches. Not with one ear open for the stove. They slept like people who weren't being hunted by the clock. That alone changed everything. Children stopped getting sick as often. Coughs lingered less. Fingers and toes stayed warm enough to work and learn. Women cooked without rushing. Men woke up with strength instead of fatigue already burned into their bodies. Less wood was cut. That meant fewer miles walked in snow, fewer chances of injury, fewer hours spent fighting frozen logs with numb hands. Every log not burned was time saved, energy saved, risk avoided. That was the real gain. Frontier life wasn't defeated by one big disaster most of the time. It wore people down through small, constant costs. Cold took sleep. Fatigue took judgment. Bad judgment took lives. By holding heat, the cabin gave those things back. It gave back mornings that didn't start in panic. It gave back evenings that didn't revolve around feeding a fire. It gave back the ability to sit still without feeling guilty or weak. People underestimate how much cold controls behavior. When you're cold, every decision bends toward survival. You rush. You cut corners. You endure instead of living. The double wall didn't make winter pleasant. It made it manageable. That distinction mattered. The families who used it weren't tougher than anyone else. They weren't luckier. They weren't better prepared in the way people like to brag about. They simply stopped paying unnecessary costs. And on the frontier, the man who wastes the least usually lasts the longest. That's what the wall really protected. Not comfort. Capacity. The knowledge didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because people stopped needing it. When fuel became cheap and abundant, the pressure changed. Instead of asking how to keep heat, people asked how to make more of it. Bigger furnaces, hotter stoves, thinner walls backed by constant energy input. The problem wasn't heat loss anymore. It was convenience. Once energy was easy, waste became invisible. People forgot what wind does to a structure. They forgot how much effort it takes to replace lost heat by hand. They forgot that every degree you lose has to be earned back with time, labor, and fuel. Modern buildings hide that cost. You turn a dial. The system compensates. You never feel the drain directly, so you never learn where it comes from. Frontier builders didn't have that luxury. They felt every mistake in their backs and lungs. If a design wasted heat, it wasted people. That feedback was immediate and unforgiving. Bad ideas didn't last long. The wall trick faded because it wasn't dramatic. It didn't look like progress. It didn't announce itself with speed or power. It just quietly reduced loss. Modern thinking prefers solutions that add something more: insulation, more output, more technology. The old solution took something away. It removed wind from the equation. It slowed the system down instead of speeding it up. That kind of thinking doesn't sell well in comfortable times. But when energy becomes uncertain again, when power fails, when fuel is limited, the old lessons return fast. They always do. The frontier didn't forget this trick because it was wrong. It forgot it because forgetting felt safe until it isn't. The lesson isn't about cabins, it's about control. Most people today still try to solve cold the same way frontier settlers did at first, by adding more heat, bigger heaters, higher settings, more fuel. That works as long as energy is cheap and systems stay online. But the moment something breaks, the math comes back. Power outages, fuel shortages, off-grid living, remote property, winter storms that last longer than expected. In those moments, the question isn't how much heat you can produce. It's how long you can keep what you already have. That's where this old wall trick still matters. You don't need to rebuild your home. You don't need special materials. The principle scales. A garage, a shed, a workshop, a cabin, even a single room, any space exposed to wind can benefit from a buffer. Stop wind first. Create a dead air space. Let heat slow down. Modern materials make this easier, but the idea is the same. Temporary wind breaks, secondary walls, enclosed porches, even stacked materials placed with intention instead of tight packing. None of it is complicated. All of it reduces loss. The biggest mistake people make today is sealing spaces too tightly without thinking about air movement. That leads to moisture mold and failure. The frontier solution was smarter. Slow exchange, not zero exchange. Control, not suffocation. This isn't theory. It's tested under conditions that punished mistakes immediately. What made it powerful then is what makes it relevant now. It doesn't depend on technology. It doesn't require constant input. It works when systems fail because it reduces the demand on them in the first place. People like to talk about resilience. This is what it actually looks like. Not toughness, not endurance. Design that respects limits. The mountain man didn't beat winter by overpowering it. He outlasted it by refusing to waste energy. That's a lesson that still holds, no matter the century. And when conditions get hard again, as they always do, the people who remember how to slow loss will always have the advantage. The frontier never rewarded pride for long. It rewarded what worked. The men who laughed at the extra wall weren't foolish. They were following tradition. They were doing what had always been done. In most years, that was enough. But when conditions turned hard, tradition alone didn't carry people through. The mountain man didn't survive because he was tougher than anyone else. He survived because he paid attention to loss. He saw that winter wasn't winning by force. It was winning by attrition. Every draft, every cold wall, every hour spent feeding a fire that should have been resting. The wall trick didn't fight winter, it refused to feed it. That's the part most people miss. Survival on the frontier wasn't about constant struggle. It was about removing unnecessary struggle wherever possible. The strongest people didn't burn themselves out, proving how much they could endure. They designed their lives so endurance wasn't required every minute. That's why this lesson lasted. Not because it was clever, not because it was dramatic, but because it respected reality. Cold doesn't care how hard you work. Wind doesn't care how proud you are. Physics doesn't bend to tradition. The men who lasted learned to work with those truths instead of against them. Some solutions look wrong at first. Some get laughed at. That's normal. On the frontier, mockery was cheap. Firewood was not. The wall that looked stupid saved heat, saved fuel, saved sleep, saved people. And that's why it mattered. Because in the end, frontier wisdom isn't about doing more. It's about wasting less. If this story changed how you think about warmth, shelter, or survival, you already understand the lesson. The smartest solutions are often the quiet ones, the ones that stop problems before they demand heroics. That's how people stayed alive long enough to pass their knowledge on. And that's how it still works today.